This is Project Management Paradise.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Project Management Paradise podcast, your passport to project success. I'm your host, Aaron Murphy, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Ben LaMorte. For anyone who does not know Ben works with business leaders to define their most important goals and make measurable progress. After successfully helping hundreds of managers to refine their team's OKRs, in 2014 he founded OKRs.com and has since guided over 100 organizations in deploying OKRs, including eBay, Adobe, and Capital One. Ben, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. How are you today?
Yeah, doing great. And I love the fact that we're talking to each other completely on different continents, but yet, we're having this amazingly intimate conversation. It's so amazing how technology has changed, right?
Absolutely. It's bridged that gap from time zone. Kind of like traveling in time.
That's right.
And Ben, to start the podcast, for anyone who might not know you, maybe you can tell us about yourself and your background, and how did you end up as an expert in OKRs?
Yeah, so I was a San Francisco-based kid, and I ended up doing engineering in college. So when I got a job, management consulting, I graduated from Stanford, and really either, if you didn't know what you were going to do, which was me, you either went into management consulting or investment banking. Well, investment banking, I realized, was a lifestyle I definitely didn't want. And I felt like management consulting would be really interesting because you have different types of clients and things like that. But when I got the job, being that I was an engineer, they said, "Hi, Ben, here's a computer. You're going to be doing spreadsheets." So I did spreadsheets, databases, PowerPoint slides was when I got a little bit more advanced. And then after that, fast forward experience, right? I ended up joining a .com startup. We failed. It was planetrx.com. We were the first to sell drugs online. Okay, these are prescription medications, not just, bad drugs. We failed. And so then I was looking for a job, like many of us in that .com era. And I kind of came to terms with, I don't think I just want to build spreadsheets. I'm more of a people person. Anyway, got a job in a startup. And in that startup, it was a software startup. I met Jeff Walker. Now, Jeff Walker is ultimately the guy that introduced me to OKRs. You see, Jeff was the CFO and founder of Oracle Applications. So he was truly a polymath, right? He was the guy that invented Oracle Financials and really took Oracle from a $20 million hardware company to $1 billion plus in the 1980s with software. And they used OKRs at Oracle. Now, at the time, I didn't know this, but Jeff became my mentor. And one of the executive meetings at my startup, he said, "Hey, Ben, I'm checking in to see how it's going." And I was just all over the place. Hey, we got the webinar coming. We got the prototypes, the sales rep, everybody's operating on all cylinders. And I'll never forget this. Jeff paused and he said, "Ben, let me ask you a question. When you go on a hike, do you have a destination?" And I'll never forget that question because at the time I had a 4-year-old daughter. I was, middle-aged or whatever, getting my life together. And I mean, we had a general idea of where we were hiking, but no, we didn't truly have a destination. I knew better than that because, my 4-year-old would see a butterfly or waterfall. And Jeff said, "Listen, when I ask you about your family, and whether you have a destination and all that, that's great. I'd love to hear about the waterfall and your daughter. But at work, do you realize that if you don't know the destination, you're wasting everybody's time in this organization?" And he basically started OKR coaching me. He started saying, here's how you talk to people. You start by saying, here's the destination, or here's that objective to where you want to improve or move. Then you give me the key results, right? The how do we know we got there? How are we going to measure our progress? And then you can talk to me about the webinar and all these other things that you're doing, right? But I don't want to hear all the stuff you're doing. And I realized it really resonated with me because so many people had told me, back in my spreadsheet days, the management consultant, "You're too in the weeds." They kept on saying that, right? "I like what you're saying, but you're too in the weeds." But they didn't give me any advice on how to get out of the weeds. Okay, that was the problem. And so Jeff helped me do that. So I started doing this OKR coaching thing. I literally channeled Jeff. And really, there was no looking back. It's just the last, 12 years or so, I've been doing this pretty much full time. And it's the most impactful work I've ever been able to do. Now, one last thing I'll give you about what Jeff said to me, because it wasn't like I had a smooth transition into OKR coaching. At the time that I started doing OKR coaching, it really wasn't a thing. You couldn't really, nobody even knew what OKRs was. So you can't really just go out and do it if nobody even knows what it is, even though you might think it's cool, right? So I was doing it at another startup, and Jeff called me up and said, "Ben, what's the one thing that you do better than anyone else that you just love to do, that you really feel brings value to the world?" And I said, "It's OKR coaching." like you were doing with me, Jeff. And he said, well, how many hours a week do you do that? I said, 3 or 4. And he said, you need to make that 30 or 40. And I'll never forget that because, my job this wasn't even my job description. But he said, if you are seriously thinking you're so great at this, and if you think it really makes an impact, you need to quit your job and go do it. And do it for free. And you'll see how big the market really is. So I actually did quit my job and I went off and it was kind of a crazy move. I just started doing this OKR coaching thing to anybody that would talk to me. And I did it for free. And about a year later, I was doing it full time and getting paid. So I guess you would say it was a success story, but it was not a linear journey at all.
Absolutely. And first of all, what an amazing mentor to get straight off the bat.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. And then second thing is no risk, no reward. You really did take that risk.
Yeah, you're right.
That's crazy. And for anyone who might actually not know what OKRs are, maybe you can define what are OKRs.
Sure. So objectives is the O and key results is the KR. And the objective is the broad statement, which is typically qualitative, right? Like, hey, where do we want to focus to improve now? Now, there's another question. I really want to relabel OKRs as OWKRs, okay? OKRs. And that's because you have your objective, and then mostly we just go to the key results, which answer the question, how do we know we've achieved the objective by a certain date, typically a short cycle, 3 or 4 months, maybe 6 months. And also it could be, how do we measure our progress against the objective? Now that has to be a measurable statement that's not subject to opinion. And it shouldn't just look like go launch the blog or complete the, Apple permit application to get on the Apple store or something like that. It shouldn't be a task. So the thing is, I want to introduce W, which is why. So here's my objective, right? We want to expand in international markets. Okay, great. But why and why now? So that's been missing from OKRs and it's starting to come into play, but I want to formally introduce it there. And then those key results are, like I said, for a short cycle of time, but they're not the things you're going to do. They're the answer to the question, how do we know, right, that we've made progress on this objective? They're the results. And then within each key result, there's an action plan, right? Okay, now we're going to do this. Now we're going to do that to drive those key results forward.
And would KPIs fall in line with OKRs, or is that a complete different topic altogether?
No, there's actually, in my book, the OKR skill book, which I'm holding up here, I've got a whole slide on that. I'm not going to go over all the differences, but I'll give you a few. So first of all, most of the key results that we encounter actually themselves are KPIs, but think of it this way. It's increase this KPI from the current value to a target value by this date, right? That itself would be a key result. So there's a lot of overlap between KPIs and key results. That said, many KPIs are what we call health metrics. So for example, if your KPI is website uptime and your website is currently 99.99% up, right? It's working. That's a pretty good healthy range. You're going to have a KPI that might look like keep it at 99.99 or higher. But that's not a key result because key results are not about keeping things the way they are. Key results are about moving the needle. And key results are a very small subset. Look, to be fair, KPIs don't have a standard definition. I talked to one of my clients, I think it was booking.com, and I said, let me see your KPI. And they said, we only have one, and it's room nights booked. That's it. That's our KPI. So everything drives toward room nights booked, plain and simple. Then I talked to another one, actually it was Capital One. It was a big bank, and they said, yeah, here are our KPIs, binders of thousands and thousands of metrics, right? And I would like, wait, I thought these were supposed to be the KPIs, right? The key performance indicators. And I think when you look around, you realize that people use the word KPI and they can mean many, many different things. Whereas with an OKR, it is defined as a singular thing, right? For example, a key result lives inside of an objective by definition. So we know how the key result connects to a higher level strategic statement. Whereas KPIs, I've seen laundry lists of KPIs. Sometimes they exist in a strategic sort of context, but other times they don't. KPIs are often used to measure performance of individual people, or for example, to allocate bonuses or measure performance. OKRs typically not. That's typically not the case. And then KPIs tend to last forever, right? You don't like KPI like revenue or something. You don't say, well, let's just not have that now. I mean, the KPI will be there, right? Forever. So help us, God, right? As long as our business is alive. And whereas with the KRs, they have a cycle time. So they have a due date, at which point we throw them out and start again. So they have a very short lifespan, And I would also just say that a lot of times when you're working with key results, they're supposed to be really stretched. So we're setting them as what's the most amazing thing we can imagine. So they get us thinking differently. And so, yeah, there's definitely some difference between key results and KPIs, as you can see, but they're also like, you can't really have one without the other to some extent.
Really interesting. And you've said OKRs help us keep our eyes on the destination. Maybe you could talk about this a bit further.
Sure. So I had, for example, one CEO come in and say, hey, Ben, I want to do OKRs. And I said, really, why is that? They said, well, we have an objective. And I love that because this is now talking about we want to execute our strategy. I said, really, okay, what's our objective? We want to improve customer retention. Okay, great. Why? Why do we want to improve customer retention? Because here's the thing. I told you earlier, it shouldn't just be OKR, it should be OWKR. So I'm going into that W. Here's what we find. If you just communicate the OKR like matter of fact, you don't get that emotional resonance. You don't get that engagement. You don't get that intrinsic motivation. So CEO comes in and says, here's the objective, improve customer retention. Here's why it's important. We are at the time, a SaaS company, right? Software as a service. And guess what? The most important thing to our success as a company is our retention rate. And this guy was a CEO that had been successful in other SaaS organizations. And he said, look, right now we're at 70%. That's not sustainable. If we can't get that, the magic number is 85%. This guy was like an industry expert. He says, if we can't get over 85%, we will never be acquired. Your stock will be worth nothing. And ultimately our company will fail. This is the number one priority for our organization. In other words, let's talk about what are the key results. How do we know, right? Well, the first one was get that darn customer retention from 70 to 85%, right? That's going to be a key result. And then there were some others, right? Increase the number of, let's say, touch points with customers to upsell on new products from whatever. They got into other key results that were more tactical. But now they were able to say, okay, let's focus on that and let's execute on that. One of the great things that the CEO did was say, that's the OKR for this next 6 months. We're not going to have others. That's the one. So keep doing whatever you're doing. Sure, other business is important. Will we take new customers? Absolutely. But I don't want marketing doing anything new to drive new customers into our pipeline. I want marketing shifting the focus into customer retention. Now we have this idea of, oh, I guess our existing customers are the key thing to our success. So when you have that strategic objective, OKRs are used to translate that into a relatively near-term action plan. And I guess the other point I would make is, look, a lot of organizations have pretty good 5-year strategies or long-term mission statements and things like that. And then they're also pretty good at knocking this feature out or getting this done this week or the next 2 weeks, checking the boxes. There's something difficult, okay, but I would argue very important about looking at that 3 to 6 month horizon, right? And that's really where OKRs come into play. So what I want to emphasize is that OKRs change all the time. So, I mean, people ask me, does the OKRs really represent the strategy? Well, we're doing our best to represent the strategy of where's the focus now, but that's subject to change, right?
Absolutely. You have to have that adaptability to go as the strategic direction of the company is moving as well.
Right.
And most of our listeners are project leaders and project managers. Maybe you can give us an example of OKRs that a project manager might set up for their team.
Yeah, I love this one. So I was working with a group. I probably won't name every company I'm working with. Let's just say I was working with a group. And I want to say they had this office of the PMO, and they had these project managers working on many different projects. And I think they had like 1,000 projects, right? Because there's a lot of projects. So we didn't want to write an OKR for every one of those projects, but we came up with tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And I think the distinction was tier 1 was like more than 3 departments working cross-functionally for more than 3 months. Okay, so that was a really serious project. The other one was, whatever, one department working on it for less than 3 months. And then the final one was a project that could be done within 1 month or something like that. Anyway, they had these 3 tiers. Of course, the tier 3, there were like 50, right? So you sort of winnowed the list down. And they said, look, for these tier 3 projects, because they're so allocations of effort is so big and massive, and we're spending so much time on this, these are probably our really important projects. Let's try to write an OKR, one OKR for each of those projects, right? What is the objective of this project? And actually, the ones that were multi-year, they would even write a mission, right? Like over all of time, here's why this product exists. And here's our customer for this project, right? This is the impact we're trying to make. Here's the service that this project will deliver, et cetera. Then we would talk about the OKR for that project. So I remember one project was something like make our API partnership program a success, right? They had this idea of getting more connectors because, well, let me give you the example. So it was, let's just use the objective as make this project a success, right? Whatever, fill in the blank of whatever that project is. And in this case, it was some API project, right? But why is that important, right? So if that's the objective, to make the project a success, the next thing the project management team does is say, here's why, right? This is why we need to focus on this project and succeed. And it was something like, well, we're losing 30%, okay, of our sales prospects due to this compatibility of connectors or whatever, okay? So they painted the story of this, there's a big opportunity on the table, and people started to get motivated. Then they had their key results. How will we know we've made this API project a success? And the first one was a binary key result, right? So there's no numbers at this one. It was what we call a milestone key result. Win our first Microsoft connector client, something like that, right? So it's either going to be yes or no. Now, the only way we could have achieved this is if we actually had the connector project complete, right? So it's not just, the key result isn't complete the connector project, right? That's more of a task. The key result is, what is the intended outcome of this project? It is to win that connector client. And right now, we didn't really care how many clients we got. We just wanted to go from 0 to 1. And a lot of times with projects, and a lot of time even with OKRs, going from 0 to 1 is a big deal, right? So that's when you get this binary milestone key result. Now, the other key result, it wasn't so focused just on, by the end of the next 6 months, boom, we have that one client. The next one was, by the end of the 6 months, now we're on track to just blow this thing out the next 6 months, right? And how did we do that? It was increase the number of sales reps who can demonstrate, or maybe it was sales engineers, right? Who could demonstrate this Microsoft connector compatibility from 1 to 10, because we only had one sales engineer who could actually demonstrate this. That's not going to help us scale. Let's get that to 10. So they would have this internal certification process. Now, again, we're trying to develop skills and we're measuring the ability of the skill, but by knowing what those key results are, that then informs what we're going to focus on when we try to execute on those weekly tasks in our project. Okay, that's the idea. Now I'm going to give you a personal story because I think this makes it even more concrete. Here I am showing up my OKR skill book. So I had written a book, by the way, so let's go back in time. 2016, I wrote this book with my buddy on OKRs. It was the first book called Objectives and Key Results. It's like a hardback textbook. I'm supposed to say you should get it, but realistically, this is the one you should get. Much more modern. Here's the deal. In the second book, I was working on it. And this was the first time I was writing a book myself. Okay, in the first book, I did it with my buddy Paul. He basically wrote it. Not as much work for me, kind of a fun process. I was a contributor. But in this next book, I was going to write the book myself. And for anybody that's even tried to do this, you know it's a bigger project. Everybody always tells you this, right? Writing a book is a bigger project than you think. So here I am doing this project, and I have a coach. And my coach says, Ben, what is the intended outcome of this OKRs field book? Why are you writing it? And here I am. I'm an OKRs coach, right? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, it's definitely not to make money, because you never really make money by writing a book like this. It's not going to be a movie, right? The OKRs field book isn't going to make me any money. Also, at the time, I had plenty of business. I don't have as much business now as I did then, ironically. But I was like, I don't need to write this book to generate more credibility. Hey, I already got a book out with my buddy Paul. Why do I need another one? So my coach said, it sounds like you're pretty clear on the reasons why you don't need to write this book. But I'm not so sure you're answering the question. What is the intended outcome of the OKRs field book? And that question, okay, Aaron, that is the question that OKRs coaches like me ask all the time. That's why they pay us money, because it's such a great question. But my point is, you need somebody else to ask you that, because you're so stuck in the work. Here I'm working on this book. I don't even really know why I'm writing it, other than it seems like I should do it because, my publisher have deadlines or something. So finally I say, you know what? The real reason why I'm writing this book is because I miss having colleagues. I want to be able to connect with other OKRs coaches around the world who were starting to approach me and asking for tips on how to do OKRs coaching, right? And I finally just wrote this book and I said, look, it's a little bit of get off my back. Here, go read this book. Okay, I didn't want it because I was getting too many coaches coming to me. But it was also, hey, join a network where we'll have an exclusive monthly event where we could all around the world talk about OKRs practices with a small group of people. Now we're about 100. So my intended outcome of the OKRs field book was to get people to then join the OKRs Coach Network, which was an idea that I didn't even have in my mind. So I then created the OKRs Coach Network, and thinking about what that would look like, I worked backward into writing my book. And I even had a chapter added, which is all about how we should join the OKRs Coach Network, right? What that is. So what I'm trying to tell you is once you're really clear about that destination, right? And you know why you're trying to achieve it, and then you can start to talk about how to measure the progress. It just gives you this much more strategic context for doing the things you're doing when you're checking off those boxes on your project.
Absolutely. And having the W in the OKRs really does prove it. And having that destination, knowing where you're heading is ideal.
Yeah, I think in the show notes, we say the title is OKRs No More. It's now OWKRs.
I like it. I like it. And from working with teams, would it be common to have one or more OKRs for a project, or is it just having one per project?
That's a great point. Look, like when we see a company will often have multiple OKRs, right? They might have one around, successfully migrate to the cloud or whatever, and then they might have another one, which is more like internal, satisfaction of our employees or whatever, right? Well, okay, so that's what I call having an internal objective that's more internal facing to our company's success inside us, and then external, more impact on the external customers. And we see that a lot with companies. And companies even have 3 or 4 objectives in many cases. Now, if you go down to a specific project, I'm going to come out and say it. I highly recommend that you limit yourself to one objective for a given project. Now, I guess there could be some exceptions to this, right? But for the most part, I really think less is more. So many people come to me, right? And they say, hey, Ben, we need help with OKRs. And I say, well, how can I help you? We have too many, right? They just have too many OKRs. And that's why I'd say it's better to actually err on the side of starting with too few OKRs. It's easier to add another OKR in later than it is to take them out. Here's an analogy. I was moving my kid into their dorm room, and they already have a bed, so I'm going to get them some sheets. But if I showed up, I was like, I'd done this before when I went to college. Like, okay, I'm getting you a light, a laptop computer, and some clothes, and maybe a toiletry kit. Let's be honest, because of hygiene, right? But the other guy shows up and has all this stuff, 2 guitars, basketballs, all this stuff, right? I mean, a bike, where are you going to put all this stuff? And you get it all in there, and then it's like, oh God, you can't even move around. And then you have to start thinking about getting stuff out. It would have just been easier to move in the essentials, and you can always add more stuff in later if you find that you need it. It's much easier to do that and much more efficient. So that's why I really err on the side of just having the one objective with probably 2, 3, or 4 key results. Maybe the very maximum would be 5 key results that represent progress on that objective.
And what are common mistakes leaders make when defining OKRs?
Oh boy. The number one common mistake is they make key results. So they're pretty good at objectives, right? Leaders are actually, it's pretty intuitive to think about, example for that project, where do we want to make the project a success? Great. Okay. We all agree on that. So, and assuming we can align on why, which is also typically pretty doable. Now we have to talk about the key results. And this is really where you see the mistakes happen, right? You start to see key results that look like to-do list items, right? Key result, launch the blog. So let's say the project is go to website 2.0, right? Launch the new website, improve our brand or whatever, something like that. Okay, so it's really cool, marketing stuff. Right. What's the key result? Launch the new website, update the color scheme, put the new logo on the site, put a blog on there, right? Just a bunch of things that you're just like, okay, do this, right? But the problem is you could check all of those boxes, but you might not make any value happen. It might be like, see, we just checked all the boxes, but did we improve? No. So that's why I like to successfully launch the new blog program, right? The keyword is successfully. And then you have your why. And then you have the as measured by. And the as measured by are the key results. So you can't say as measured by, we posted 5 blogs. So what? I like to call this the so what test. If I'm a leader in the company and I come by and I say, you posted 5 blogs, do I care? On the one hand, I might say, how much money did it cost me to post those 5 blogs? How many people is it who's working on this? But my real question is, so what was the outcome of those 5 blogs? Did they move the needle, right? That's what I'm wondering if I'm a leader. So as an OKR coach, we have to ask that person. And by the way, these people aren't stupid, right? This is how our brains work. I'm going to go do this. I'm going to post 5 blogs. Yeah, you probably should do that. But you have to ask yourself the question, what is the intended outcome of posting those 5 blogs? And then we go further down the value chain, and eventually we get there, right? Kind of like I had to do with my book, right? What is the intended outcome of writing the book? It's not just check the box. It's let's make a measurable impact. And maybe it's something like increase the number of people signing up on the blog landing page to learn more from, 0 to 50 by the end of the quarter or whatever. If you set some kind of a target of, I want to see some measurable impact here. Because look, if I would rather have 1 or 2 really high impactful blogs that really make an impact than having 100 blogs that really don't make an impact, right? What I really care about is that result more so than what did I do? I did this and I did that. Like, and that's again, when I was in the weeds, I did this and I did that. I got this blog going. You should see my 4th blog. It'll be totally amazing. The leadership team doesn't care. They want to know, okay, that's great that you're doing the blogs. What's the result? And so leading with the result, we're going to try to get 50 new leads from the blog. Right now, I've posted 3 blogs. This one has given us 10 leads. They're like, well, do more of those, That's the level of conversation as opposed to, let me show you my blog calendar, right? Now I'm in the weeds. Let me show you on April, I'm going to come up with this amazing blog. It's about Elon Musk. I think we're going to get a lot of traffic, blah, blah. Oh, I don't want to hear all this, Hey, do you want me to send you a draft? I'll email it to you now. The leadership team doesn't care. I hate to say it. And it took me a while to realize that.
No, they want to see the end result and the value it's delivered rather than just seeing a number of boxes ticked.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's the number one problem, making key results that actually look like boxes ticked. Please don't do that, and try to think about what is the intended outcome of getting all of those boxes ticked. What would success look like? And then write a very small number of key results. That's why I talk about 2, 3, or 4. Don't give me a list of 25 key results. Nobody wants to see that.
And maybe you can share an example of a project that struggled with OKR, or should I say OWKR implementation, and the lessons they learned to eventually succeed.
Yes, we had a project which was effectively operation. It was an insurance company. Okay. And what they wanted to do was start getting their partners to sell insurance. Okay. This was a business expansion idea. And so instead of going with direct sales, they brought in these guys and they said, look, we're going to have partners pay $1,000. We're going to have partner training. We're going to all these different partner things to get our partners out there selling these insurance policies. And well, they didn't really know what they were doing, but they tried it. They beta tested it and it went pretty well. They got about 100 partners to sign up. And I think maybe half of them actually sold insurance. And they were like, okay. So the CEO said, ooh, this looks good. I want to put more resource into this. Let's go ahead and double our partners from 100 to 200. And I would like to make a target of 500 because really that's the future. The partners is the way it's more scalable. So they put their project together to actually, roll out the partner program. And it was all about getting more partners. So, creating collaterals, doing whatever they need to do. There's all these different check the box activities. But midway through the cycle, they stopped because yes, they were getting some partners, but what happened was they weren't getting the right partners. So instead of, partners selling the premiums because, hey, they got $1,000, skin in the game, they started to learn, we don't really want more partners, right? We want to get a smaller set of quality partners. And it kind of comes into play a lot with OKRs because it's easy to measure, move it from X to Y, right? Like get more of this. I want more of that. But the problem is more better. And in this case, they learned that actually no, and then they have all these maintenance issues with these partners and they have to try to communicate with them. And it was not a really good approach. So they learned, and this is the most important part of OKRs, right? Which is they learned that getting more partners is not necessarily better. We want better partners. Then we had to ask the question, what is a better partner? A good partner is one who sells 3 insurance premiums in the first month. In other words, they're successful right out of the gate. And they found that because those people tended to be successful the next month and the month after. So they changed their key result for the next cycle. And we call this a reflect and reset learning process, where you take what you learned, because you will fail. A lot of these projects are going to fail early, right? In the first 3 to 6 months, you're going to get feedback that says, uh-oh, we're doing it wrong. So then you pivot. And one of the great things about OKRs is the earlier you can pivot and the more you can take what you've learned and have it inform, right, your next cycle of OKRs, then the more successful you'll ultimately be. So we actually, as OKR coaches, we try to encourage people more to reflect on what they're learning, even when they're winning, so that they can take that learning and apply it into the next cycle. And I mean, look, people fail on these key results all the time. That's actually part of the culture of OKRs. It's okay to fail, fine print, as long as you're learning and communicating and moving in the right direction, because of the fact that these OKR cycles are so short, right? That we have plenty of time to keep on getting better and better.
Absolutely. You will always learn more through your failures than through constant success. And then to touch on another point, it's quality over quantity as well.
Yes. And quality may be harder to measure, but the time that you spend with your team defining on what does high quality look like, it is always time well spent. It's going to be difficult. But the point I'm making is, if we don't know what quality is, guess what? We're going to all go work and we're not aligned on what quality work looks like. So guess what? We don't have any way of really knowing if we're improving quality. Right? I saw this one teacher meeting I went to, and it was the same thing. They kept on saying, the problem is we need to have more respect for our teachers. And they were like, yeah, that's the problem. We need to have more respect for our teachers. Well, how would we know if we had more respect for our teachers? I actually asked the question. I started going into OKR coaching mode at the school meeting, right? And they were like, well, the behavior of the kids. Really, what specific behavior are they doing that's showing no respect? And how are we measuring that, right? We need to be able to come back here. What would it look like if we came back here? What data would we point to? What graph would we show? That would say, see, now we're having more respect for our teachers. And then we started talking about that. And eventually we got some indicators and we were able to talk about it. So we could have a conversation about, that we're aligning on, agreeing, as opposed to, I don't feel like we have respect for our teachers. Oh, I feel like we have respect for, the English teachers, but the math teachers, no. I don't. Anyway, it was just such a waste of time to have these conversations. So I think even though it may be very hard to have a conversation on what quality looks like and how we can measure it, the time that you spend doing that will be invaluable, because it will prevent wasted time at scale throughout the next, 3 to 6 months where, you're not on the same page. So it's hard, though. I have to admit, it is hard to get definitions of what we're really talking about with quality in many cases. But again, I want to emphasize it's time well spent. So as an OKRs coach, sometimes my workshops will become totally, derailed, because we'll realize we need better sales reps. And it's not just how much they sell. Like, we had this model of ranking our sales reps, and everybody was looking at it in the meeting and they're like, yeah, but Tony's not the best. Tony's one of the biggest jerks in our company. Why is he number one? Tony was selling all these deals, but these were toxic deals. He was handing them over to the implementation team, and the implementation team would be screwed. And he was out, celebrating his big bonus or something. So they realized Tony's not an A player. They were like, well, wait a minute. What is an A player? They had never defined it. They kind of had this feeling inside of them, but they never wrote down. So we spent like the next 4 hours, breakout groups, figuring out what makes an A team, a sales player be an A team guy or girl. And that conversation was the one we needed. And then it informed how we recruit. It informed how we do our sales training. It informed how we recognize the salespeople. And it was more than just a number, right? As a cutthroat bottom line number, which ultimately then informed their culture, because they wanted to say we're a culture that doesn't just care about money. Well, if you only reward people based on money, it's kind of weird to say our culture is like, not only about money, right? You got to line up your actions with your culture.
Absolutely. Ben, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It was really insightful, some great nuggets of information for our listeners to take. And the final question I do have for you is, if anyone wanted to reach out to you, get in contact, maybe get some of your OKR services, where's the best place to reach you?
Yeah, that would be www.okrs.com. And on that site, you can download the PDF preview of the OKRs Fieldbook. You can go through, request an intro call. You can read the blogs. You could tell me whether my blogs are having any kind of an intended outcome at all, which, by the way, is you have to click on the call to action at the bottom of the blog. That way I know you actually read it. Those are the best ways to get in touch with me.
Ben, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'll make sure to include all your contact information in our show notes. And for anyone who is listening to this episode of the podcast and you've gotten some value from it, we would greatly appreciate if you could leave us a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Ben, once again, thank you so much for joining me on the Project Management Paradise podcast.
Hey, that was a lot of fun. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks for listening to the Project Management Paradise podcast at projectmanagementparadise.com. Your feedback is always welcome. We'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to leave a review, or you can email your comments or guest suggestions to hello@projectmanagementparadise.com. Finally, If you have not already done so, don't forget to subscribe.